Well, here we are again, everybody. Spooky season, Halloween, October country. We're
Two
back.
more days till Halloween. Halloween. Best Halloween movie made.
That's right. This is the time of the year where everyone in the world starts acting like we act most of the time. I'm not talking about comics. I'm talking about horror movie fanatics. People look for movie recommendations. They look for scary books to read. And in the spirit of all that stuff. So I just wanted to take a quick look back at the beginning of horror comics.
So we're going back in time?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Like a lot of things in comic book history, to find the origin of horror comics ends up being a little bit complicated. Because if you know anything about the Golden Age, you know that just about everybody who ever heard of a comic book in the Golden Age used it as a get-rich-quick scheme. You had con men and shysters and all kinds of
Criminals.
other people, just organized crime, just publishing things left and right that disappeared as quickly as they appeared.
And it was garbage.
Right. A lot of it was definitely garbage. So that history gets a little fuzzy right at the beginning. And you couple that with the idea that a lot of early superheroes fought supernatural monsters, then yeah, it gets even fuzzier. But I honestly have to say, I don't think the superheroes fighting monsters counts as horror comics. When I think about a horror comic, I think of a comic that is devoted to just a horror story. When you introduce a superhero to a horror story, it kind of stops being a horror story.
Becomes a superhero story.
Becomes a superhero story, right?
Right.
Superheroes just kind of dominate whatever they
right.
get involved in. So, faced with these complications, I'm going to go with the consensus of most comic book historians and say the very first fully horror comic book was the Gilbertons adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde,
Really?
published in August of 1943. Gilberton was an imprint of Elliott Publishing Company. It went independent in 1941. And what these series really were kind of like Classics Illustrated,
Okay.
where they took literature and adapted it into comic book form in an attempt to get kids reading comics to
read the books.
read more literature.
Well,
right?
Still doing that today.
So yeah, it's a horror comic, but it's not really what we think of as like an original horror comic, right? But it is still counts in most people's opinions as the first all horror comic. If we move ahead, we were looking for a real original horror comic, then we have to jump to 1946 with the release of Eerie #1. Cover dated January 1947. Eerie was put out by Avon Publishing. I want to be really clear. This is not the same Eerie that was published by Warren magazines in the 60s.
But is it the same Avon from the 70s that sold?
Yeah, the same that did the paperbacks and everything. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, like I said, there were Avon Publications put this Eerie out. There were 6 stories spread out over 52 pages. It's a lot of reading for a dime.
That's a lot for
right?
a dime.
Yeah. As far as writing credits go, we only know that one of the stories was written by sci-fi author Henry Kuttner, writing under his pseudonym of Edward Bellin. The issue featured art by some truly great artists of the Golden Age. For instance, you had art by George Roussos, you had Fred Kaida, and a very young Joe Kubert.
Joe Kubert, the great Joe Kubert.
The synopsis of the stories reads like a blueprint for all the horror anthologies that came later. A man is haunted by the ghost of a taxidermy tiger. People encounter an island that's occupied by man-eating lizards. A man disposes of his nagging wife by pushing her in front of a subway train.
That seems to be a reoccurring theme in horror comics.
Yeah, the nagging wife thing.
Nagging wife being killed
and then he
gruesomely.
is, what happens after that?
She haunts him.
She haunts him. Eventually drives him insane.
It's better to keep them alive.
Yep. The backup story featured a humorous tale about a character called Goofy Ghost.
Do we ever see Goofy Ghost again? Or?
I don't think so, because Eerie disappeared after this first issue. Went dormant. Avon held on to the license for it, and then started publishing it again in 1951 when horror comics were back on the rise with
so
EC and all that stuff.
Is it the same? It's not the same Eerie, but it is kind of connected in some way.
Right.
Okay.
The Eerie that comes out in 1951,
which everyone knows,
returns with a #1, right? Had a cover by Wally Wood.
Yeah, the cover is very famous.
Big famous cover, yes. That second volume of Eerie ran until 1954. On the secondary market, a good copy of the first Eerie, the one from 1946, goes for about $100,000.
Wow, that's a lot for probably a crappy comic.
Golden Age.
Wow, 100,000 is a lot, though.
But the distinction is that it was the very first.
Okay.
of its type. It was the first horror anthology comic. Yeah. So while Eerie may have been the first horror comic, the first successful horror series was Adventures into the Unknown from American Comics Group. Adventures in the Unknown ran for 174 issues.
Wow.
I had no idea it ran that long. It ran from 1948 to 1967 and succeeded in laying the groundwork for all the big horror comic boom that would come much later. It would leave a profound and lasting impact on the comic industry. The first issue of Adventures into the Unknown, which was cover dated fall of 1948, didn't have a month. It was a seasonal at first.
So did it run quarterly at first or no?
Yeah, ran quarterly first.
Which makes more sense.
Right. Later it ran monthly. The entire script, all the stories in it were written by pulp stalwart Fred Belknap Long, who was also a friend of H.P. Lovecraft and wrote a whole bunch of Cthulhu mythos stories during his career. It featured art by Ed Moritz, has this great classic cover of a young couple about to enter a haunted house, colored almost exclusively in purples and yellows, which are really, really cool looking. Had art by Fred Gardner, King Ward, and a bunch of others. Interestingly, when the infamous EC Comics fell under the imposition of the Comics Code Authority during the later 1950s, Adventures into the Unknown actually survived that whole tumult. And it survived by basically switching its stories to more science fiction based.
Yeah, I know Adventures in the Unknown.
Yeah.
I know the title, and not as a horror title.
No, it became
as a sci-fi title.
A weird sci-fi title later, and it got rid of a lot of those horrifying elements that had made it so famous in the first place. Unfortunately, this also made it sort of bland, and longtime fans no longer were following it. So by 1967, its sales had dropped, and they had canceled it.
And that was still at who?
It was still from the original company.
The
original company.
So that company outlasted a long time.
Yeah, and it was an independent technically.
And you think back then, a lot of companies came in and were out within a couple of years.
Oh yeah,
to stick around for 10 plus years
in the golden age.
Yeah.
Within months, a lot of them are gone. So, even though it survived much longer than a lot of the comics that it inspired, 67 or so, it was kind of bland and people stopped reading and it died out. This is also really, really expensive to find on the secondary market, but luckily for we price-conscious ghouls...
Not me, him. I spend way too much money on comics.
Dark Horse is reprinting compendiums of Adventures into the Unknown stories. And it's a great little look about how all this horror comic anthology stuff started. So if you're really into horror comics, go and look for some copies of those. They're well worth it. So this Halloween, when you're reading new issues of Creepshow, or maybe you're reading Epitaphs from the Abyss, these brand new horror comic anthologies that are actually really, really good, give a thought to the origins of how this whole medium got started, because you never know when a long dead entity might crawl up from the grave and grab what it deserves by the throat. Best to be ready. Until then,
love what you collect.
Collect what you love.
We'll see you next time.
See you soon.
In the cemeteries.